So welcome to this BlazeMeter session. We're going to look at the new test data orchestration feature in BlazeMeter. So test data orchestration can be used in our functional and our performance tests, and we have other videos you can watch that show how that works. But in this session, we're going to look at how to build a test data orchestration job and how to run it. So what does Test Data Orchestrator do? Imagine that you've generated your test data as part of your BlazeMeter test. But what you need is that data not just to be in the test itself, but perhaps within the application you're testing, perhaps in a database or in a mock service. What Test Data Orchestrator allows us to do is to take our generated data and then to send it to the application server. Now, obviously, you could take the data and inject it into the database, but the problem there is you need to understand the schema, you need to have access to the database. So this is not ideal for developers. However, normally you can actually inject data into the database via the application server. So what we can do with test data orchestration is to take the data that we're generating. Via an API, we can then publish that to your system under test. And what that also allows us to do is to then take the response that comes back from that action and use that in our test data. So in our example here, we're going to create a user and the response returns the IDs. And as you can see in our graphic, the name, the birth date, the password are all being generated by BlazeMeter. This ID is actually coming back from the application server, and this is then combined into our test data that we can use in our test. So in the demonstration, we're going to show you how to build this test data orchestration. So let's go to the demonstration now. So here we are in BlazeMeter. We've created a test, and the first step is going to be a login. We're going to log in with a username and a password. We're then going to go to a profile and validate that the first name and last name match the logged in user. Then you can see that all these values are parameterized, and these are coming from our data model, and that's the data model. So like the new user password, as you can see here, we have a formula that will generate a password. If I click on the preview, we're going to get a random password. If I click on the email address, the same thing's going to happen, but in this case we're using seed lists to come up with our email address. So first name, last name, and an email provider. If I click on the data settings, we can then look at this rule and you can preview the data. So as you can see, we've got preview of first name, last name. If I scroll over, we can see how they're combined into the email address, and we've also got the physical address and also our passwords that we're generating. And you may notice that the ID column is empty. And that's empty for a reason. When we actually do the data orchestration, we're going to send these user details to our application server, which will return an ID value. And we're going to store it in this column. So the actual test will not only have access to the data we're generating, it can have access to data that comes back from the application server during the data orchestration phase. So what we need to do now is actually create our data targets. So we can go to data target, and this is our data target screen. So let's start by creating our data target. Now let's name it, and you'll see why that's important later. And we're going to go in the settings tab first. And what this allows us to do is to set some default values. So the first is where this execution will run. So default is in the cloud on a public location. If you have public locations, OPLs, you can select those and it will run within your location. You can also choose to run this either once or once for each data row. And that depends on how the API that you're working with actually works. And in the configuration properties, you can then define some defaults. So we're going to use this to define some defaults to the base URL. This is also where you'd set things like proxy settings. So we're going to set the base URL. Just going to paste in there our base URL for the system we're working with. We then go back to the API request. And what we need to do is two steps. The first step is to send our credentials to our server and get back a token. Once we've got that token, in the next step, we'll use the token to then create a user. So this first step is that creation of the token. So we're going to use our base URL, like so. So that's our base URL followed by the rest of the path. And what we need to do is put in the password for our user and then the name of the user. Now we can just test this at this point. If I click the publish button and we go to the logs, we're now validating this. And what we can see is we've got an error. And if I scroll down, we should then better see what this error means. Username is not present. So let's go back to the API request. And that's because I missed off the equals. So let's just add the equals. We run that again. So as you can see, the logging is very easy to work with, and now that test worked. So you can see we've now passed our request, and what came back was a token. Now what we need to do is to obviously make that token a variable. So let's go back to API requests, and in extract from response, we can add a variable. So the first thing we can do is obviously give it a name, and we're going to call it auth token, and we're going to add that as a local variable. We then say what response we need to look at. So we can look at the body or the header. We can then use JSON pointers, regex or nextpath to identify the value we need. We're going to use JSON pointers. And then we just need to put in there the name of the token, the actual pointer. So we're going to run this command. If I run it again now, the difference we're going to see in the log is we'll still see the same request. We'll still see the same token. But what we'll get is this extracted variable here, and we'll say that it's now been set to that auth token. We can now use that in the next part of our API. So let's add another API request. Now this second request is going to be the request to actually publish the content into our application server. So this is the endpoint we're going to use. And again, we're using the base URL. Slightly different this time, we also now need to set some headers. Now the first header is obviously the authorization, and this is taking the token from the first step, that auth token, and then passing it in the header of the second step. We also need to set the content type, and finally we need to set the accept value. Now that's the defaults in the header. Now for this API call, what we also need to do is in the body, send the actual data. So the username, password that I showed you, we're going to encapsulate that into the body of this API call and pass it to our server. So this is the body. And what you need to do is obviously pass in the data from our data model. So if we take here the address, we just add that to our body. And we then parameterize it. We do the date of birth. Same thing, if you click on the copy, you just put the date of birth in. And finally, we do the email address. And as you can see, basically you're just populating the body with the parameters from our data model. So I'll just update all of those. So right, we now got the body with our parameters, and we can now test. So let's click publish again, and we click the logs. And like before, we're going to log in, get the token, but now we're going to make a call to create a user. So this is the user we've just created, Kenzie. And we got back the ID. So this is the response that came back from the application server. So we've got the ID, we've got some details about the account, as well as the details of the user. And what we want to do now is capture that ID. So in that request, we're going to do an extract from response. And like we did with the token, we're going to do with the ID. So we know the ID is actually /ID to find the ID. Slightly different this time is instead of actually assigning the value to a local variable, we're going to assign it to the data model. So you can see when I click on here, this is the data model. So on the right hand side, you can see the data model. You can see the same thing. So I can choose to say that ID field that is blank in our data model, we're going to say, create this user, the response will come back as an ID, and we're going to then store it inside the data model within our test. And we're going to add one more step just to show that we can actually use that API. And the slight difference this time is this is going to be a get method. And what we need to do is just pass the ID. So we're going to put in the URL like so. And then we're going to take the ID from here and just include it in our data model. And then like before, we need to set up the header because this one also needs to have the tokens. So we've now got 3 steps. Get a token, pass the data, and then basically do a get to get the data back to validate it. And if I run that, and again we go to logs, so this is step 1. Here's our token. Here's the extracted value. Step 2, you can see we're using that bearer token in step 2. We're then creating this user Stephanie. It came back as ID 35596. We made that a variable. And in step 3, we then took that variable, included it in the next call, and then again we get back the response. So we've now just created 10 users. Now what we want to do is obviously when we actually run this test is to do a cleanup process. So if I click on the cleanup API request, we can now add the corresponding API calls we need to clean up. So as long as your API supports inserting and removing, the cleanup, we can literally just do the same as we did with the creation. So the first step is the same thing. We need to get a token. And then the second step will be deletion. So let me just fill in the first step. So we're going to call the URL. We're going to take the response, create it to a token. Then we're going to add the last step, which is delete. So the delete method, we're going to take the ID from the creation and use it to delete the object. So like before, we just add in the URL. We then take the ID value and include it in the endpoint. And we just need then to add our authorization, which again is going to take the token from the first step. And then our content type, which is the same as before. And finally, the accept value. Now what will happen is when the test executes, we will run all of the steps in this API request. When the test completes, we'll run all the steps in the cleanup API. And as you saw, the logs are here. Now, one thing I didn't talk about was when you looked at these API calls, we also have a failure assertion. And what this allows you to do is to set a rule as to what to do if the API sends back a non-positive error code. So if I add an assertion here, we can say HTTP codes. Now we can say, what if you don't get a 200? Now it may be that you're expecting to get a certain value, and when you get that value, either you don't want to use that data or you want to stop the test. So a typical example would be you get a 500 error. So what do you want to do if when you make this API call you get a 500 error? Do you want to just stop this iteration? Do you want to stop publishing completely? Do you want to stop publishing and the test? Or just exclude the data from the test? So it's possible you can actually use this API call to take the data that we're generating, send it to a system. Based on the response we get from that system, it may be you may then choose to exclude that data from the data set that you're going to use. Now in our case, we're going to say if we get a 500, that's quite a major issue. We're going to stop the publishing and the test because we probably need to investigate why that's not working. But you can add here multiple combinations. So you can have different response codes. You can also add response body. Same thing, based on the response body. No, you may want to also make decisions based on the body of the response. So if we go back to our test and we just scroll down to the bottom section, you'll see in the test data orchestration section the name of any orchestration rules that have been created. And from here, you can then toggle these on and off. So if we were to add another orchestration one here, So we just name this create account. We give it a URL. We click save. You now see we've got 2 of these. Now you can toggle these on and off, so within each test you can then choose which of these orchestration jobs to run, and this is the same for functional and for performance. So we have other videos that have shown data orchestration used with functional performance, but finally I want to just show you how you can actually see the logs and the information that you use when a test actually runs. So we're looking here at a functional test that ran. If I click on the show test data, this is the test data that was generated by the test data system. Now to actually get the logs, so the published logs, the unpublished logs, you need to go and look at the report engine. So if I go to the reports, show reports, you see the sessions that were part of the functional test. And if I click on the logs tab and we go to the R4 log, what you'll see is there'll be a published log and a corresponding unpublished log. And this is obviously is the pre and the post log. Now, if we go to a performance test, the logs are in the log tab. So here's a performance test. If we go to the logs and we look at our engine, same thing, you see there's the published and the unpublished. If we download these two, what we'll see is if we do the publish first, it's the same as the log we looked at in the actual editor. So you see the request, as you can see here, here's our token. The second step is the data. Like we showed, you get back the ID. There's the ID, and the step 2 on the ID. And the unpublished is basically the unpublished request. So again, you've got the login, like so, followed by the deletion and also the response codes that come back. So I hope you enjoyed this demonstration of test data orchestration. For more details about BlazeMeter, please go to blazemeter.com, where you will find videos and blogs, and also links to BlazeMeter University, where there's lots of free courses about BlazeMeter and also open source tools.